Welcome to Thueringer for Farming Simulator 15. We now continue our read of My Antonia by Willa Cather in Book 2, Part 4. Mrs. Shimerda, leaning out of the window, enjoyed the situation keenly and was sorry when Antonia sent Mary away, mollified by an apronful of bottled tomatoes. Lena came out from Tony's room behind the kitchen, very pink from the heat of the feathers, but otherwise calm. She begged Antonia and me to go with her and help get her cattle together. They were scattered and might be gorging themselves in somebody's cornfield. Maybe you lose a steer and learn not to make some things with your eyes that marry the men, Mrs. Shimerda told her hectoringly. Lena only smiled her sleepy smile. I never made anything to him with my eyes. I can't help it if he hangs around, and I can't order him off. It ain't my prairie. Part 5. After Lena came to Black Hawk, I often met her downtown, where she would be matching sewing silk or buying findings for Mrs. Thomas. If I happened to walk home with her, she told me all about the dresses she was helping to make, or about what she saw and heard when she was with Tiny Soderball at the hotel on Saturday nights. The boys' home was the best hotel on our branch of the Burlington, and all the commercial travelers in that territory tried to get into Black Hawk for Sunday. They used to assemble in the parlor after supper on Saturday nights. Marshall Field's man, Anson Kirkpatrick, played the piano and sang all the latest sentimental songs. After Tiny had helped the cook and wash the dishes, she and Lena sat on the other side of the double doors between the parlor and the dining room, listening to the music and giggling at the jokes and stories. Lena often said she hoped I would be a traveling man when I grew up. They had a gay life of it, nothing to do but ride about on trains all day and go to theaters when they were in big cities. Behind the hotel there was an old store building where the salesmen opened their big trunks and spread out their samples on the counters. The Black Hawk merchants went to look at these things and ordered goods, and Mrs. Thomas, though she was retail trade, was permitted to see them and to get ideas. They were all generous, these traveling men. They gave Tiny Soderball handkerchiefs and gloves and ribbons and striped stockings and so many bottles of perfume and cakes of scented soap that she bestowed some of them on Lena. One afternoon in the week before Christmas, I came upon Lena and her funny square-headed little brother Chris standing before the drugstore, gazing in at the wax dolls and blocks and Noah's Arks arranged in the frosty show window. The boy had come to town with his neighbor to do his Christmas shopping, for he had money of his own this year. He was only 12, but that winter he had got the job of sweeping out the Norwegian church and making the fire in it every Sunday morning. A cold job it must have been, too. We went into Duckford's dry goods store, and Chris unwrapped all his presents and showed them to me. Something for each of the 6 younger than himself, even a rubber pig for the baby. Lena had given him one of Tiny Soderball's bottles of perfume for his mother, and he thought he would get some handkerchiefs to go with it. They were cheap, and he didn't have much money left. We found a table full of handkerchiefs spread out for view at Duckford's. Chris wanted those with initial letters in the corner because he had never seen any before. He studied them seriously while Lena looked over his shoulder, telling him she thought the red letters would hold their color best. He seemed so perplexed that I thought perhaps he hadn't enough money after all. Presently he said gravely, "Sister, you know Mother's name is Bertha. I don't know if I ought to get B for Bertha. or M for mother. Lena patted his bristly head. I'd get the B, Chrissy. It will please her for you to think about her name. Nobody ever calls her by it now. That satisfied him. His face cleared at once, and he took 3 reds and 3 blues. When the neighbor came in to say that it was time to start, Lena wound Chris's comforter about his neck and turned up his jacket collar. He had no overcoat, and we watched him climb into the wagon and start on his long, cold drive. As we walked together up the windy street, Lena wiped her eyes with the back of her woolen glove. I get awful homesick for them all the same, she murmured, as if she were answering some remembered reproach. Part 6. Winter comes down savagely over a little town on the prairie. The wind that sweeps in from the open country strips away all the leafy screens that hide one yard from another in summer, and the houses seem to draw closer together. The roofs that look so far away across the green treetops now stare you in the face, and they are so much uglier than when their angles were softened by vines and shrubs. In the morning, when I was fighting my way to school against the wind, I couldn't see anything but the road in front of me. But in the late afternoon, when I was coming home, the town looked bleak and desolate to me. The pale, cold light of the winter sunset did not beautify. It was like the light of truth itself. When the smoky clouds hung low in the west, and the red sun went down behind them, leaving a pink flush on the snowy roofs and the blue drifts, then the wind sprang up afresh with a kind of bitter song, as if it said, "This is reality, whether you like it or not." All these frivolities of summer, the light and shadow, the living mask of green that trembled over everything, they were lies, and this is what was underneath. This is the truth. It was as if we were being punished for loving the loveliness of summer. If I loitered on the playground after school or went to the post office for the mail and lingered to hear the gossip about the cigar stand, it would be growing dark by the time I came home. The sun was gone, the frozen streets stretched long and blue before me, the lights were shining pale in kitchen windows, and I could smell the suppers cooking as I passed. Few people were abroad, and each one of them was hurrying toward a fire. The glowing stoves in the houses were like magnets. When one passed an old man, one could see nothing of his face but a red nose sticking out between a frosted beard and a long plush cap. The young men capered along with their hands in their pockets and sometimes tried to slide on the icy sidewalk. The children in their bright hoods and comforters never walked, but always ran from the moment they left their door, beating their mittens against their sides. When I got as far as the Methodist church, I was about halfway home. I can remember how glad I was when there happened to be a light in the church, and the painted glass window shone out at us as we came along the frozen street. In the winter bleakness, a hunger for color came over people, like the Laplander's craving for fats and sugar. Without knowing why, we used to linger on the sidewalk outside the church when the lamps were lighted early for choir practice or prayer meeting, shivering and talking until our feet were like lumps of ice. The crude reds and greens and blues of that colored glass held us there. On winter nights, the lights in the Harlings' windows drew me like the painted glass. Inside that warm, roomy house, there was color too. After supper, I used to catch up my cap, stick my hands in my pockets, and dive through the willow hedge as if witches were after me. Of course, if Mr. Harling was at home, if his shadow stood out on the blind of his west room, I did not go in, but turned and walked home by the long way through the street, wondering what book I should read as I sat down with the 2 old people. Such disappointments only gave greater zest to the nights when we acted charades or had a costume ball in the back parlor with Sally always dressed like a boy. Frances taught us to dance that winter, and she said from the first lesson that Antonia would make the best dancer among us. On Saturday nights, Mrs. Harling used to play the old operas for us, Martha, Norma, Rigoletto, telling us the story while she played. Every Saturday night was like a party. The parlor, the back parlor, and the dining room were warm and brightly lighted, with comfortable chairs and sofas and gay pictures on the walls. One always felt at ease there. Antonia brought her sewing and sat with us. She was already beginning to make pretty clothes for herself. After the long winter evenings on the prairie, with Ambrosia's sullen silences and her mother's complaints, the Harlings' house seemed, as she said, like heaven to her. She was never too tired to make taffy or chocolate cookies for us. If Sally whispered in her ear or Charlie gave her 3 winks, Tony would rush into the kitchen and build a fire on the range on which she had already cooked 3 meals that day. While we sat in the kitchen waiting for the cookies to bake or the taffy to cool, Nina used to coax Antonia to tell her stories about the calf that broke his leg, or how Cholka saved her little turkeys from drowning in the freshet, or about old Christmases and weddings in Bohemia. Nina interpreted the stories about the creche fancifully, and in spite of our derision, she cherished a belief that Christ was born in Bohemia a short time before the Shimerdas left the country. We all liked Tony's stories. Her voice had a peculiarly engaging quality. It was deep, a little husky, and one always heard the breath vibrating behind it. Everything she said seemed to come right out of her heart. One evening when we were picking out kernels for walnut taffy, Tony told us a new story. Mrs. Harling, did you ever hear about what happened up in the Norwegian settlement last summer when I was threshing there? We were at Iverson's and I was driving one of the grain wagons. Mrs. Harling came out and sat down among us. Could you throw the wheat into the bin yourself, Tony? She knew what heavy work it was. Yes, ma'am, I did. I could shovel just as fast as that fat Andern boy that drove the other wagon. One day it was just awful hot. When we got back to the field from dinner, we took things kind of easy. The men put in the horses and got the machine going, and Ole Iverson was up on the deck cutting bands. I was sitting against a straw stack trying to get some shade. My wagon wasn't going out first, and somehow I felt the heat awful that day. The sun was so hot, like it was going to burn the world up. After a while, I see a man coming across the stubble, and when he got close, I see it was a tramp. His shoes stuck out of his toes stuck out of his shoes, and he hadn't shaved for a long while, and his eyes was awful red and wild, like he had some sickness. He come right up and begins to talk like he knows me already. He says the pounds in this country is done God know a man couldn't drown himself in one of them. I told him nobody want to drown themselves, but if we didn't have rain soon, we'd have to pump water for the cattle. Oh, cattle, he says. You'll all take care of your cattle? Ain't you got no beer here? I told him he'd have to go to the Bohemians for beer. The Norwegians didn't have none when they threshed. My God, he says, so it's Norwegians now, is it? I thought this was America. Then he goes up to the machine and yells out to Ole Iverson, Hello, partner, let me up there. I can cut bands, and I'm tired of tramping. I won't go no farther. I tried to make signs to Ole, 'cause I thought that man was crazy and might get the machine stopped up. But Ole, he was glad to get down out of the sun and chaff. It gets down your neck and sticks to you something awful when it's hot like that. So Ole jumped down and crawled under one of the wagons for shade, and the tramp got on the machine. He cut bands all right for a few minutes, and then Mrs. Harling, he waved his hand to me and jumped head first right into the threshing machine after the wheat. I began to scream, and the men run to stop the horses, but the belt had sucked him down. and by the time they got there stopped, he was all beat and cut to pieces. He was wedged in so tight, it was a hard job to get him out, and the machine ain't never worked right since. Was he clear dead, Tony? We cried. Was he dead? Well, I guess so. There now, Nina's all upset. We won't talk about it. Don't you cry, Nina. No old tramp won't get you while Tony's here. Mrs. Harling spoke up sternly. Stop crying, Nina, or I'll always send you upstairs when Antonia tells us about the country. Did they never find out where he came from, Antonia? Never, ma'am. He hadn't been seen nowhere except in a little town called Conway. He tried to get beer there, but there wasn't any saloon. Maybe he came in on a freight, but the brakeman hadn't seen him. They couldn't find no letters, no nothing on him, nothing but an old penknife in his pocket and the wishbone of a chicken wrapped up in a piece of paper, and some poetry. Some poetry, we explained. I remember, said Francis. It was the old oaken bucket cut out of a newspaper and nearly worn out. Ole Iverson brought it into the office and showed it to me. Now, wasn't that strange, Miss Francis? Tony asked thoughtfully. What would anybody want to kill themselves in summer for? In threshing time, too. It's nice everywhere then. So it is, Antonia, said Mrs. Harling heartily. Maybe I'll go home and help you thresh next summer. Isn't that taffy nearly ready to eat? I've been smelling it a long while. There was a basic harmony between Antonia and her mistress. They had strong, independent natures, both of them. They knew what they liked and were not always trying to imitate other people. They loved children and animals and music and rough play and digging in the earth. They liked to prepare rich, hearty food and to see people eat it, to make up soft white beds and to see youngsters asleep in them. They ridiculed conceited people and were quick to help unfortunate ones. Deep down in each of them there was a kind of hearty joviality, a relish of life, not over delicate but very invigorating. I never tried to define it, but I was distinctly conscious of it. I could not imagine Antonia's living for a week in any other house in Black Hawk than the Harlings. Part 7. Winter lies too long in country towns, hangs on until it is stale and shabby, old and sullen. On the farm the weather was the great fact, and men's affairs went on underneath it as the streams creep under the ice. But in Black Hawk the scene of human life was spread out, shrunken and pinched, frozen down to the bare stalk. Through January and February I went to the river with the Harlings on clear nights, and we skated up to the big island and made bonfires on the frozen sand. But by March the ice was rough and choppy, and the snow on the river bluffs was gray and mournful looking. I was tired of school, tired of winter clothes, of the rutted streets, of the dirty drifts and piles of cinders that had lain in the yard so long. There was only one break in the dreary monotony of that month, when blind D'Arnault, the Negro pianist, came to town. He gave a concert at the Opera House on Monday night, and he and his manager spent Saturday and Sunday at our comfortable hotel. Mrs. Harling had known D'Arnault for years. She told Antonia she had better go to see Tiny that Saturday evening, as there would certainly be music at the boys' home. Saturday night after supper I ran downtown to the hotel and slipped quietly into the parlor. The chairs and sofas were already occupied, and the air smelled pleasantly of some cigar smoke. The parlor had once been 2 rooms, and the floor was sway-backed where the partition had been cut away. The wind from without made waves in the long carpet. A coal stove glowed at either end of the room, and the grand piano in the middle stood open. There was an atmosphere of unusual freedom about the house at night, for Mrs. Gardner had gone to Omaha for a week. Johnny had been having drinks with the guests until he was rather absent-minded. It was Mrs. Gardner who ran the business and looked after everything. Her husband stood at the desk and welcomed incoming travelers. He was a popular fellow, but no manager. Mrs. Gardner was admittedly the best dressed woman in Black Hawk, drove the best horse, and had a smart trap and a little white and gold sleigh. She seemed indifferent to her possessions, was not half so solicitous about them as her friends were. She was tall, dark, severe, with something Indian-like in the rigid immobility of her face. Her manner was cold, and she talked little. Guests felt that they were receiving, not conferring, a favor when they stayed at her house. Even the smartest traveling men were flattered when Mrs. Gardner stopped to chat with them for a moment. The patrons of the hotel were divided into two classes: those who had seen Mrs. Gardner's diamonds and those who had not. When I stole into the parlor, Anson Kirkpatrick, Marshall Field's man, was at the piano playing airs from a musical comedy then running in Chicago. He was a dapper little Irishman, very vain, homely as a monkey, with friends everywhere, and a sweetheart in every port like a sailor. I did not know all the men who were sitting about, but I recognized a furniture salesman from Kansas City, a drug man, and Willie O'Reilly, who traveled for a jewelry house and sold musical instruments. The talk was all about good and bad hotels, actors and actresses, and musical prodigies. I learned that Mrs. Gardner had gone to Omaha to hear Booth and Barrett, who were to play there next week, and that Mary Anderson was having a great success in A Winter's Tale in London. The door from the office opened and Johnny Gardner came in, directing blind D'Arnault he would never consent to be led. He was a heavy, bulky mulatto on short legs, and he came tapping the floor in front of him with his gold-headed cane. His yellow face was lifted in the light with a show of white teeth, all grinning, and his shrunken, papery eyelids lay motionless over his blind eyes. "Good evening, gentlemen. No ladies here. Good evening, gentlemen. We going to have a little music? Some of you gentlemen going to play for me this evening?" It was a soft, amiable Negro voice, like those I remembered from early childhood, with the note of docile subservience in it. He had the Negro head, too, almost no head at all, nothing behind the ears but folds of neck under close-clipped wool. He would have been repulsive if his face had not been so kindly and happy. It was the happiest face I had seen since I left Virginia. He felt his way directly to the piano. The moment he sat down, I noticed the nervous infirmity of which Mrs. Harling had told me. When he was sitting or standing still, he swayed back and forth incessantly, like a rocking toy. At the piano, he swayed in time to the music, and when he was not playing, his body kept up this motion, like an empty mill grinding on. He found the pedals and tried them, ran his yellow hands up and down the keys a few times, tinkling off scales, and turned to the company. "She seems all right, gentlemen. Nothing happened to her since the last time I was here. Mrs. Gardner, she always has this piano tuned up before I come. Now, gentlemen, I expect you've all got grand voices. Seems like we might have some good old plantation songs tonight." The men gathered around him as he began to play My Old Kentucky Home. They sang one Negro melody after another, while the mulatto sat rocking himself, his head thrown back, his yellow face lifted, his shriveled eyelids never fluttering. He was born in the far South on the D'Arnault plantation, where the spirit, if not the fact, of slavery persisted. When he was 3 weeks old, he had an illness which left him totally blind. As soon as he was old enough to sit up alone and toddle about, another affliction, the nervous motion of his body, became apparent. His mother, a buxom young Negro wench who was the laundress for the Darrenalts, concluded that her blind baby was not right in his head, and she was ashamed of him. She loved him devotedly, but he was so ugly with his sunken eyes and his fidgets that she hid him away from people. All the dainties she brought down from the big house were for the blind child, and she beat and cuffed her other children whenever she found them teasing him or trying to get his chicken bone away from him. He began to talk early, remembering everything he heard, and his mammy said he wasn't all wrong. She named him Samson because he was blind, but on the plantation he was known as Yellow Martha's simple child. He was docile and obedient, but when he was 6 years old, he began to run away from home, always taking the same direction. He felt his way through the lilacs along the boxwood hedge, up to the south wing of the big house where Miss Nellie Darrenall practiced the piano every morning. This angered his mother more than anything else he could have done. She was so ashamed of his ugliness that she couldn't bear to have white folks see it. Whenever she caught him slipping away from the cabin, she whipped him unmercifully and told him what dreadful things old Mr. Darrenalt would do to him if he ever found him near the big house. But the next time Samson had a chance, he ran away again. If Miss Darrenalt stopped practicing for a moment and went toward the window, she saw this hideous little pickaninny, dressed in an old piece of sacking, standing in the open space between the hollyhock rows, his body rocking automatically, his blind face lifted to the sun and wearing an expression of idiotic rapture. Often she was tempted to tell Martha that the child must be kept at home, but somehow the memory of his foolish, happy face deterred her. She remembered that his sense of hearing was nearly all he had, though it did not occur to her that he might have more of it than the other children. One day Samson was standing thus while Miss Nellie was playing her lesson to her music teacher. The windows were open. He heard them get up from the piano, talk a little while, and then leave the room. He heard the door close after them. He crept up to the front windows and stuck his head in. There was no one there. He could always detect the presence of anyone in a room. He put one foot over the windowsill and straddled it. His mother had told him over and over how his master would give him to the big mastiff if he ever found him meddling. Samson had got too near the mastiff's kennel once, and had felt his terrible breath in his face. He thought about that, but he pulled in his other foot. Through the dark he found his way to the thing, to its mouth. He touched it softly, and it answered softly, kindly. He shivered and stood still. Then he began to feel it all over, ran his fingertips along the slippery sides, embraced the carved legs, tried to get some conception of its shape and size, of the space it occupied in primeval night. It was cold and hard and like nothing else in his black universe. He went back to its mouth, began at one end of the keyboard, and felt his way down into the mellow thunder as far as he could go. He seemed to know that it must be done with the fingers, not with the fists or the feet. He approached this highly artificial instrument through a mere instinct, and coupled himself to it, as if he knew it was to piece him out and make a whole creature of him. After he had tried over all the sounds, he began to finger out passages from things Miss Nellie had been practicing, passages that were already his, that lay under the bone of his pinched, conical little skull, definite as animal desires. The door opened. Miss Nellie and her music master stood behind it, but blind Samson, who was so sensitive to presences, did not know that they were there. He was feeling out the pattern that lay all ready-made on the big and little keys. When he paused for a moment, because the sound was wrong and he wanted another, Miss Nellie spoke softly. He whirled about in a spasm of terror, leaped forward in the dark, struck his head on the open window, and fell screaming and bleeding to the floor. He had what his mother called a fit. The doctor came and gave him opium. When Samson was well again, his young mistress led him back to the piano. Several teachers experimented with him. They found he had absolute pitch and a remarkable memory. As a very young child, he could repeat, after a fashion, any composition that was played for him. No matter how many wrong notes he struck, he never lost the intention of a passage. He brought the substance of it across by irregular and astonishing means.